Hi everyone, my name is Suborno from Stony Brook University. So today I'm so honored to be meeting with the president of Stony Brook University, and I'm so honored because I'm interested in history. It's kind of like a side hobby I have. I know that you're a very renowned historian, especially on the American slave trade. So I was very interested in the five books that you've written centered around that topic. You published five different books, starting from In Pursuit of Refinement in 1999, all the way to your most recent book, Educated in Tyranny, in 2019. So, over 20 years, you've been writing books about this subject. So, first of all, before I talk about any of your specific books, can I just ask what motivated you to write so many books about this topic?
Yeah, thank you for that question. The honor is mine to get to meet and talk with you. So this is good fun. So I ended up focusing on this topic because I was raised in the American South. And I was raised in the American South in a period not that long after the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And one of the outcomes of the passage of the Civil Rights Act is that schools were supposed to be integrated. Schools that had previously been segregated, schools that were white only and black only, were supposed to become mixed. That didn't really happen. Other things that I think many people hoped would happen after the passage of the Civil Rights Act is that America would tell a fuller, more complete, and more honest history. And I can tell you from my going to school in America in the 1970s and then in the 1980s, I went to college. It was not until I got to college that I heard a different version of history. So the version of history that I was taught in America's schools were much more focused on slavery as if it had been a benevolent and beneficial institution to Africans and African Americans. And when I went to college, I suddenly was beginning to hear a very different history. And thus, when I began my graduate work, it was clear to me that there was so much work that needed to be done in that place. And I believe that an important part of our ever moving forward as a society for the US and elsewhere is for us to be honest about even the really horrific parts of our past. And when we think about the racial tensions and the legacy of both slavery and segregation in the US, there's so much that we first need to be honest about to then begin to make improvements.
Yes, of course. Revisionism in terms of slavery is definitely something that should be avoided at all costs. Rewriting history so that it favors us, even if it wasn't actually true, is definitely not the way to do things. History is meant so that we can learn from it and better ourselves as a society. So trying to cover it up and pretend that we're already perfect completely defeats our purpose. So, uh, thank you so much for writing these five books. I'm sure it's inspired me, but I'm sure it's also inspired thousands of other people who originally did not know that much about the slave trade or were ignorant about it to start going in and doing more research to realize how large its true scale was. So, I want to cover your first book, written in 1999, about In Pursuit of Refinement. Uh, so that was about South Carolina near the turn of the 18th century. And I wanted to know South Carolina, as you mentioned, had a very strong connection to European culture, one that's unlike a lot of other cities in the U.S. So I want to know, what do you think was the main driver of that connection with European culture?
Yeah, so great question. So as we think about the European settlement of the New World, there were multiple different factors, right, that led to settlements in different regions. And so if we contrast New England settlement, which was predominantly people coming here in part for religious reasons, they wanted to be able to practice their religion as they wished to practice it, and that was often distinct from what was happening in England at the time. South Carolina actually follows a settlement pattern that's more similar to what was happening in other islands of the Caribbean, where the predominant motivation was for people to be running plantations that were going to earn them a lot of money. That's a very different reason for settling. And so, for the white settlers who came to South Carolina, some of them came directly from the British West Indies, others were coming from England. Many, not all, but certainly many were there in order to establish large plantations to be run and labored on by hundreds of African slaves, to then make them a lot of money. And they continued to think of themselves more as English colonists than they did, as South Carolinians. This is all before the establishment of the United States of America. And even if you go back to that history and you begin to look at the discussions that were had about the Declaration of Independence and then into the framing of the Constitution, there's real tension between the North and the South, and the greatest tension is with those South Carolinians because they just had an entirely different set of motivations at play. Many of them continued to be educated in England. They went back to England. They had portraits made. They had furniture made. They spent years sometimes living there and traveling throughout the rest of Europe. For them, South Carolina was very much a source of wealth.
I see. So South Carolina was more a bastion for people from England or Britain who didn't want to establish a new identity because of their different sect of the main religion, Christianity, at that time, but rather because they wanted to own these large plantations. So they didn't want to create a new identity for themselves, as in what happened in the Northeast, but rather they wanted to just spread their influence. And they would frequently commute back to England and basically just treat South Carolina as like a part of England in the New World.
Right. And so what that book links to a museum exhibition. So, this is common for people who work on things that are about objects, paintings, furniture, decorative arts. And it is really amazing the amount of art and other fine objects that the South Carolinians brought into Charleston that is directly from England and elsewhere in Europe. And that is different and distinct from what was happening in New England, for example. And the people who settled New England, many of them were Protestant, but they weren't Church of England, which was the only sort of real religion easily practiced in England at the time they left. So most of them were Calvinist Protestants. They were Puritans, Congregationalists. You go to South Carolina, most everybody is either an Episcopalian or a Presbyterian, right? Either Church of England or Church of Scotland. So just very different settlement patterns.
I see. So those are the kind of cultural differences that arise from different purposes of colonization. So,
and I will say one other big difference that relates very much to today was the income inequality. So the people in South Carolina grew to be by far the wealthiest of the people residing in America's colonies, by many, many hundreds of times at the time of the Revolution. And even by the Civil War, still per capita 10 times wealthier than anywhere else in America. So slavery in South Carolina proved enormously financially advantageous to that smallish group of white individuals living there, making their money off the forced enslavement and labor of Africans and African Americans.
I see. The wealth difference too, because of the larger advent of slavery. Also, I'm sure it contributed to an anti-abolitionist sentiment later on when the U.S. gained its independence. So now I want to ask about your second book, written in 2005, which focuses on South Carolina's role a little bit later, right before the Civil War. So the politics of taste in antebellum South Carolina, and especially its capital, Charleston, played a very big role in the Civil War as a whole. South Carolina was the first state to secede as part of the Confederacy. However, it still had a considerable anti-abolitionist sentiment and anti-slavery sentiment, and similar to a state like Virginia, for example, it was sort of pinned between abolitionism and slavery. It's also where the first battle, the Battle of Fort Sumter, began, which was obviously a big Confederate victory because the Union soldiers there were basically doomed. And at the end, there was a reversal of roles. The final battle took place once again at Fort Sumter, and that was the last time the Union flag was raised during the Civil War. Carolina, and especially Charleston, played a very big role in the Civil War. How do you think that role affects South Carolina's history nowadays, and how does it affect the nation's history as a whole?
Yeah, what great questions. So you so rightly point out, like Charleston's at the epicenter of all of this, right? Not only the place where the Civil War broke out, but the city and the state out of which much of the pro-slavery rhetoric of the 1850s had emerged. Like a number of the big thinkers in that space were either Charlestonian or South Carolinian. They really helped drive the politics of division that ultimately led to South Carolina being the first state to secede, right? They were quick to get out of the Union. Um, After the war, South Carolina and Charleston were, in many ways, devastated. They were devastated economically. They were devastated by the amount of bombardment from Union troops into the city, the number of battles that had been fought there, but mostly economically, right? Because overnight, all their money was based in agriculture, and overnight, their labor force was free. And rice, which was the main crop for South Carolina in the area of Charleston, what they call the Low Country, all the land close to the shore, rice cultivation diminishes significantly and is gone by about the 19 teens. And so South Carolina plummets economically. They are, along with Virginia, the main sort of sources of the writing of what we often call the lost cause, which is part of that revisionism that changed how we talked about slavery and how we talked about the reasons why the Civil War was fought. In my childhood, I was always taught that the Civil War was fought about states' rights. It was never about the right to own people, right? And that's really what the war was fought over, was over slavery. South Carolina continued to fly the flag of the Confederacy over the South Carolina State House until, I don't remember what the year was, but it's like 1990 something. And then they move it just off to the side on the Capitol grounds. And it was not until, what's the year, 2016 maybe, when there is a white supremacist who walks into an African American church in Charleston and kills, I think it's either 9 or 11 church members. It was a really famous sort of, mass murder for white supremacist reasons. And it was after that that the then governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, finally removed the Confederate flag from the South Carolina Capitol grounds. So that's about 150 years after the war. So when you think about that legacy as having been the state that sort of led us to the Civil War, where the Civil War started, that continued to sort of, promulgate racial division until that, one could argue they still are, but symbolically, as long as that flag was on their Capitol grounds, it speaks a lot to the powerful legacy of the American Civil War, America's original sin in enslaving Africans, and the racial discord that we still have today because of the number of people who retain prejudices against African Americans and the considerably more difficult time that many African Americans have accessing great education, accessing opportunities that would allow them to live up to their potential.
I honestly don't know what to think about that, especially South Carolina, so long after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, after every other state in the United States seemed to get along well, although obviously everywhere there is definitely still a little stain that persists. But at least in name and mostly de facto, uh, there was basically no racial division. South Carolina still proudly flew that flag until very recent. So
Amazing, isn't it?
yeah, it's hard to think about.
Yeah.
So I wanted to skip around a little to
Yeah.
your fourth book because it's the one that I guess hit me the hardest or inspired me the most.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of an art fan, well, not anymore, but still, art has been a very pivotal way for me to express what I'm feeling because I think you can tell I'm not the best with my words. So art is definitely the way where I can express my sentiments the most.
Yep.
And in Slaves Waiting for Sale, which was your fourth book, written in I believe 2013, you discussed the how the slave trade was represented through art, specifically through one British artist uh, named I think his first name was Eyre Crow.
Yeah.
So
in England they pronounce it air. So Air Crow.
So Eyre Crow. Sorry.
No, that's good.
Yeah. I thought it was pronounced differently, like Ireland. But yeah, so Eyre Crow's paintings, when he looked at the slave trade, he looked at the slaves waiting for sale and was horrified at the tension building up. That really struck me a lot. And I just want to ask this biggest question first, get it out of the way. So, slaves waiting for sale, as it says in the name, is about slaves uh, at a European port city waiting to be shipped off to the Americas. So, uh, given that it isn't directly depicting the violence they will endure on the fields or the horrific capture from their native homes, what about it builds tension and inspires empathy for the slaves depicted?
Yeah, so thank you. Great question. First, interestingly enough, it is not a painting of the African slave trade. It is a painting of what is often referred to as the domestic slave trade or the internal slave trade. So America and Britain both quit participating in the African slave trade. Britain in 1807, America in 1808. And so after that point, the people who are being sold at auction are being sold from one part of the US to another part of the US. And what was most commonly happening is the more northern states that still had slavery, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, had more humans living in enslavement than they actually had worked for. And so they would sell people from Virginia. We'll just use Virginia as an example because that painting was set in Richmond, Virginia. They would sell people from Richmond to New Orleans because that was exactly the same time that cotton was booming as a commodity crop. And so those states needed more laborers. And so Crow was at an auction in Richmond, Virginia. And he was there, like he saw it. And that's one of the things that's so amazing about that picture because very few visual artists had ever actually seen this moment. And so other artists who painted auctions were just conjuring it in their imagination from what they read in written descriptions. I think part of what was seen as so pivotal about Crow's work is that he moved away from that more expected depiction of somebody on the auction block and the kind of going, gone of a sale, that kind of theatrical moment. And he instead showed a group of people, mostly women, children, and then one man on the side, who are at that moment of not knowing what their fate is going to be. They don't know to whom they're going to be sold, and they therefore don't know how far away from their families that they will be sent.
Yes, of course. So I don't remember his name, but I read an account of a former slave
Mm-hmm.
who
Yep.
was trying to appeal to Europeans to stop the slave trade
Right.
around the end of the 1700s. He was talking about the horror he had. He was actually first in the domestic slave trade in Africa. He was being kidnapped from his home by Africans who were sending him to the more elite tribal leaders. But they treated him kind of like family. But then they had to receive some money, so they sold him off to Europeans. And at that point, he didn't know where he was going to go. If he was going to die. He said at one point he thought they were kidnapped him for food and were going to eat him, and
Oof.
it was really shocking for me. It was a depiction of slavery that I had never learned about before, and I guess the emotions on their faces in that picture really captures just the feeling of dread they have of not knowing where you will go, if you will die, what you're going to be doing, and if it's even worth it to be alive anymore. So that moment of contemplation they're having, especially the children and women and that guy at the side,
Yeah.
they're all thinking, "Oh, what am I going to do here? Will I have any worth as a human anymore? Will I ever see the people that I know and love again?" Yeah. So I guess that's what really brings the emotion to that image that isn't directly theatrical, doesn't show someone being beaten with a whip or being kidnapped from their home or being sailed off in a ship. It just shows them waiting for that moment in time where they know what that future is going to be like.
And in many ways, he's therefore connecting with them as humans as opposed to as commodities, right? So it's that shift from just thinking about them as an item to be sold, but instead to connect with them on an emotional level. And no other artist had done that before. And he happened to exhibit it in London in the month that the American Civil War broke out. So all of a sudden, he's a young artist, he's relatively unknown when he exhibits this painting. He becomes something of the real interest because topically, he has now painted about the thing that is of greatest interest in London. And the English are a little torn about how they feel about slavery, American slavery, because a lot of them make a lot of money from the US cotton trade, right? Because cotton gets grown in the US and it either gets shipped to New England or it gets shipped to England to be made into cloth from which people are making their many millions.
Yes, I've heard about that. In fact, I'm pretty sure there were a few European countries that were considering sending military support to the Confederates because, uh, especially, the cotton coming from them was in danger, and the Confederacy was one of their. The Confederacy were the states that provided basically all the cotton, not all the cotton, but a significant portion of it to these European countries. I'm sure that that really adds that kind of emotion in the air, really adds that final touch to make people think of them as not objects that are simply going through trade, and that it doesn't matter how you treat them, how you beat them, if they even come out alive at the other side. It helps you humanize them and realize that could be any one of us. In 2019, Educated in Tyranny, which covers the University of Virginia,
Yep.
Was that was established by President Jefferson. President Jefferson himself was not the biggest fan of slavery, but he didn't want to prohibit it anyway at the behest of all of the other delegates at the Constitutional Convention were really fans of slavery because they had hundreds of slaves themselves. And so Jefferson really just came to appease them. He had a few dozen slaves himself and did some unsavory things with them. But what you covered in that book was how, despite the University of Virginia was meant to provide equal education to everyone, to decrease the inequality in the world, it was built on inequality itself, as the construction of its halls involved slave labor. So, uh, I want to know how do you overcome dilemmas such as that, where and how can you acknowledge your history while still uh, doing it in a way that promotes understanding of everyone?
Yeah, so the University of Virginia is an institution I know well. It's where I attended as an undergraduate. I then was on the faculty there for about 20 years. So I used to teach courses in which I would lecture one day out of a full semester class, talking about this history of enslavement at UVA, and it was one that I knew in broad strokes, but not in great detail. And it was my students who encouraged me to start a large project so that we could read through all of the university's archives in order to find out all that we could possibly know about slavery. And so now, more than a decade later, there are still students who are working on university archives, letters and diaries from faculty and students. Everything gets transcribed and XML tagged and put into a large search engine, all of which you can search on your own, right? So it was meant to be a public history project, and it was out of that that we told the history of slavery at UVA. Jefferson is such a pivotal figure in both US history and world history, right? I mean, it is what ultimately becomes the United States Declaration of Independence that argues in many ways for the rights of man, for as he says in words, all men are created equal. But of course, in America, that was not a true statement, right? Not all men were equal, and obviously women were not equal either. And yet, those are ideals that America still strives for today. It is not an ideal that I believe we have ever achieved, and it's not clear to me that we will, certainly anytime, maybe during my lifetime. Maybe we'll do better during yours. Um, so he was a man who, on one level, believed in equality. In the 18th century, the most pointed element of that is not believing that monarchs, kings, and queens are divinely different from anybody else, right? That they are chosen by God to be king of France or king of England. That was a radical concept at the time. And America saying, we will not have monarchy and we will elect our leaders and nobody is born into it, that was all pretty radical at the time. You rightly say that Jefferson's kind of torn on the topic of slavery. As a younger man, in a number of instances, most particularly in the Declaration, and a number of things he wrote, he seemed to be moving in the direction of arguing for the abolition of slavery. But later in his life, that all kind of goes away. And he stops arguing for abolition. And many historians have spilled volumes and volumes trying to figure out exactly what Jefferson feels about slavery. The project of his old age was the creation of the University of Virginia, which he both writes about doing to try to ensure the continuance of democracy, but he also writes about it as being appropriate for Southern sons so that they do not have to be educated in the North with people who are against us in principle. And that whole notion of being against us in principle refers to slavery. So he builds an institution where he uses enslaved labor not only to build the institution, but then to run the institution, right? Who prepares the food for the faculty and students, who cleans the classrooms, who chops the wood for the fireplaces, like all of that was always intended to be done by enslaved labor. And he designs the buildings of the university. He was an architect, both to be a classroom aesthetically. He's teaching people about Greek and Roman design and architecture. But he also designs the university to have space for the enslaved to live and work and to be separated from the faculty and students. So everything that he designed about UVA is both about, let's make sure that bright students from Virginia, no matter their wealth, who are men, white men, can be educated. But let's also keep the sons of Virginia in Virginia, and all of this is going to be run by enslaved people. So UVA is this enormously complicated history that is both about ideals we are still striving for, but also being built on the most horrific inequality and on the back of enforced labor.
Of course. So the University of Virginia was really only trying to rectify economic inequality. They really were advocating against some sort of equality through race or gender, etc. They're trying to spread ideals of slavery, trying to make it a social norm, so that when people finally are destined to come up to the North, they see abolitionism as a gross new concept that should not be treated as serious by the rest of the civilized world. So it's basically sort of meant to indoctrinate them into thinking that slavery is just something that happens. It's just another kind of trade. And those are the main ideas of all your 5 books. It's it's very fascinating to get to learn about them, uh, to read them, and to come back with lessons learned about the persistence of slavery in America, even after independence, even after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, and how inequality still persists to the present day, and how even if we might not ever reach it, we are still making good strides today. Uh, you'll never reach infinity if you count to it, but you'll at least get closer every time.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, thank you for this conversation. It's my honor.
no problem. It's been a pleasure to meet you, and I've really gotten to understand more about you. I'm I'm very honored to be at a university that is held by such an honorable and well-renowned historian, and I hope that in your endeavors in the future, you keep writing about this sort of social inequality and expose the cracks that need to be fixed in our modern society.
Thank you for that. And I wish you all the best in your endeavors. You have so many things that you can explore and learn, and we all look forward to seeing what you do.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
And happy holidays to you.
Yeah. Hopefully, I'll be back here for the spring semester.
I hope so. I hope so. And if you see me on campus, please say hello.